Welcome to Friday Tech Tips Week 5. I know we've covered a lot of ground during these Friday videos, but I feel that I've overlooked the important cast off. So today I'm going to show you two of my favorite cast off methods and when I use them and why I use them. I have a few sample garments here to show you the different cast offs. So here we have our regular cast off. It does have a fair bit of stretch given that this is knit 2 purl 2 ribbing, but my favorite cast off methods are a little bit stretchier than this. So this particular cast off is just working in the rib pattern as set, knit 2 purl 2 for this particular sweater, and I did knit 2, slip 1 over, and then I did a purl 1, slip 1 over, purl 1, slip 1 over, knit 1, slip 1 over. So I'm not disrupting the rib pattern. That is something that new knitters get a little bit confused with. They think that casting off is all knitting, but no. When you're casting off, you always keep your pattern sequence. So if it's moss stitch, you still do your moss stitch. If it's ribbing, you still do the regular ribbing row. If it's garter stitch, then you're just knitting every row and casting off. So I have used the regular cast off around the neckband and the sleeve cuffs. But I do find that around the sleeve cuffs, because it's a 3/4 sleeve on this particular sweater, that I could have used a bit more of a stretch just to get over the wider part of the arm. So that is the regular cast off, which of course you know how to do, so I'm going to move on from that. And I'm going to start with the super stretchy cast off. Okay, so feel free to work along with me if you like. I'm just working on a stocking stitch sample today. But if you were working the super stretchy cast off in ribbing or moss stitch, you would again continue with your pattern sequence. And I am a continental knitter, so I hold the yarn in my left hand, so I hope that's not too difficult for your viewing. I'm knitting the first stitch, and I'm knitting the second stitch, which is the normal process when we cast off. We always knit 2 to start, and then usually we slip the first stitch over the second. But to create the super stretchy cast off, I'm going to slip those 2 stitches back onto the left needle, but keep my right needle in place. So the first 2 stitches are actually on both needles, right on the tips, and then I'm just going to knit those 2 together through the back loop. And I'll knit 1 more stitch, and then I'll slide my left needle into the 2 stitches, keep your right needle in position, and then just bring the yarn around knitways and come through the back of those 2. Knit 1, slide the first 2 stitches onto your left needle, knit 2 together through the back loop. And I'll have to get to the end of the row before I can show you how much stretch this creates. And if you're using a thicker yarn like I am that's barely spun, you might find that your needle catches the wool a little bit. So I'm knitting 1, sliding 2 onto my left needle, keep my right needle in position, and knit through both. There are a few other methods for a stretchy cast off. I find that this one is the easiest to remember, and it really gives a nice edge without being too loose or without leaving holes. Now, the only time you wouldn't want to use this stretchy cast off is when you are finishing, say, the top of a sleeve you're casting off, or a shoulder seam, because you can see it is making a thicker edge than normal, and that is just going to make a bulkier seam when you sew a sleeve in or a shoulder seam together. So we've got 2 more to do. I'm on my last stitch. I'm going to knit it, slip it onto the left needle, and knit the last 2 together. So I'll give you a close-up of that particular method. Has a bit more of a pronounced chain on the top edge, and look at all that stretch. So I would use this type of cast off when I'm doing toe-up socks. Toe-up socks, you really have to be careful with your cast off because that ends up being around the widest part of the calf. And for some people, they need extra circulation, diabetics especially. So you have to give them as much ease and stretch as possible at the top of a sock. I would also use this method if I were doing a top-down shawl pattern and I had to cast off very loosely for the final row, because you want to be able to block your shawl and stretch out the bottom width as much as possible. So that is the super stretchy cast off. Now I have to carefully undo my stitches and show you the next method. It is good to have a few different cast-off methods in your knitting file box. And then you have the opportunity to use the one that's best suited to the project. Well, my yarn is a little bit catchy, so that took longer than expected. Okay, so I'm back to the beginning of my knit row, and let's show you first what the next cast off looks like. This is called the Icelandic bind off. The terminology is always different in the US than in Canada or in Europe. So bind off and cast off do mean the same thing, but we have to keep it formal, so we'll call it the Icelandic bind off in case you're looking it up or you see it in a knitting pattern. So this is a top-down sweater, love note. And because I was knitting the ribbing, the twisted rib at the bottom, I felt I needed a little bit more stretch and elasticity than a regular cast off would give me. I also wanted to have an edge that was more rounded, not quite as flat and not quite as flat as a regular cast off. So that is why I chose the Icelandic bind off for love note. So I did it at the bottom ribbing, and I did it on the sleeve cuffs to match. So the Icelandic bind off gives you a nice rounded edge. It's almost like a mini I-cord edge. You don't see a right side and you don't see a wrong side, and you don't have a sharp edge. So I've used the Icelandic bind off on a chunky weight in the love note, and then I will show it to you in a finer summer weight. And the reason I used it on this particular sweater, which is Sunshine Coast, a top-down t-shirt with A-line shaping. So if I were to do a regular cast off in stocking stitch at the bottom of this sweater, the edge would curl up. You've probably found that's a problem too. And no matter how many times you block it and pin it and wash it and steam it, the edge just curls up because it doesn't have enough bulk there in the finer yarns. So there are ways to fix that. You could always crochet a row of single crochet. You could do a couple rows of garter stitch, even 2 rows of ribbing. But I didn't want to take away from the very smooth lines of this sweater design. So that's why I chose the cast off method that I've done. So Icelandic bind off at the bottom and on the sleeve cuffs. It's very subtle, but it's almost decorative in this type of yarn, which is cotton, linen, and bamboo. So I will show you this one next. Okay, there's a little bit more thinking involved. So I'm going to knit my first stitch as normal. And then I'm going to slip it onto my left needle, but I'm not slipping it on in the same direction I took it off. I'm going to bring my left needle around and twist it. So the first stitch has been twisted slightly to the left. Okay, and then the next part is with my right needle, I'm going to go through the stitch that's been worked. So I'm just slipping it the way it sits on the needle, purlways, and I'm going to knit the second stitch. So that means when I'm knitting the second stitch, I'm pulling it part way through the first stitch to grab the right leg of it, so that when I'm knitting, I have somewhere to bring the yarn through. And I'm going to slip that one off, and then we'll repeat. Take your left needle, swing it around to the right side of the stitch, so you're twisting it, and slip it onto the left needle. Slide your right needle purlways into the first stitch, grab the second stitch to knit, lift it onto your right needle so you feel it's loose, bring the yarn through just that second stitch. You don't want to catch the first stitch, it's already been knit, and slip it off. You can keep your yarn a little bit looser than normal if you like. It's not going to make the edge sloppy. So repeat. I'm going to slip the first stitch, twist it onto the left needle, and then my right needle is going to slip through that twisted stitch and grab the second stitch and knit it. So when I bring my yarn through, I'm only bringing it through the second stitch. And repeat again. So there are 2 extra steps involved compared to the super stretchy cast off. But it's really up to your own preference, and if you like the look of this edge, it's certainly worth learning it. Patience and perseverance, that's all you need. And a yarn that doesn't split. You'll be quite amazed how it keeps the top edge perfectly flat and it doesn't curl backwards. So I use this particular bind off most often on top-down sweaters because I like the decorative look of it. I don't use it often on toe-up socks. I use the super stretchy one for that. And whether you have a project that's worked in ribbing, moss stitch, or stocking stitch or garter stitch, whatever it may be, you're still doing this knit method that I've shown you for the cast off. So there we go. Look at how much stretch there is. And it's quite a pretty edge. It It's rounded, there's no beginning, no end, and it's decorative. And even though I haven't blocked this piece, I can tell with a damp towel overnight that this would lie perfectly flat. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's video on casting off. And if you have any future suggestions you'd like to pass on to me, please leave a message in the comments of any tech tips you'd like to learn. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for watching, everybody.